Warning, the following story is a work of fiction. Although fictional, it covers topics such as sexual abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse, disembowelment, and murder. If it is not your cup of tea, I suggest you take this time to exit this video and find another one. But if you're still with me, you have been warned, and enjoy tonight's story.
They are children, David. They don't know any better.
Oh, fuck me, Maribeth. I don't want to hear none of your bullshit excuses. I have just about had enough of them.
And what do you plan to do about it?
The girl heard loud footsteps coming towards her room, and she hugged her giraffe closer. The door opened violently, and in the doorway stood her large, infuriated, overweight father. In one of his meaty hands, he held a large textbook.
David, stop it!
Screamed her mother, but the father ignored her wife's plead cries. He grabbed the little girl harshly by the collar, and she screamed as she screamed and kicked, trembled in fear. The girl's father held a textbook. "This is for drawing on the fucking walls, you little bitch!" Years later, that little girl, known as Natalie, was now 9 years old. Going through the stage of puberty, she was naturally a little chubby. Like the usual, she sat in her room, watching TV. Her dad was ranting about how some economic crap that she really could give less a shit about, as she munched on some popcorn. She was also currently drawing a picture. There was a bit of gore in it, but strangely, she really liked drawing blood. It gave her some weird satisfaction. Other than that, multitasking was no problem for her. It became apparent at her young age, after having to do so much hard work and labor, that she was able to do so many things at once. Drawing ended up being her talent and passion. It was her way of escaping from reality whenever something bad would rear its ugly head and peer in, or when she was simply bored. She suddenly heard a closing of her door and looked to the left, pausing on munching on her popcorn. There stood her brother Lucas, who was 14 years old.
What is it?
She could still hear her father yelling from outside her door. "Dad's scaring you?" He lets out a chuckle.
No way. I think we're both used to his yelling by now.
There was a long pause.
So why are you in here?
He played with his sleeve slightly and twisted a bit. "I have to ask you something." He trained his eyes on her. She frowned slightly, growing impatient with her brother, interrupting her movie and drawing.
What?
He moved a little closer. "You said you wanted to be cool and grown up, like a teenager, right?" She nodded and suddenly brightened up slightly. "Well, I have an offer."
Just spit it out, you dimwit.
You, know what guys and girls do together sometimes, right?" The next day at school, Nellie did not say a word. She did not speak for the whole day. She didn't have anyone to speak to anyway. Nobody could know. Nobody should know. And so, nobody would know. Her teacher picked up on a few of her puzzled expressions, but she dismissed it as if she did not understand the lesson. Nellie also felt that she was in severe pain. She had no idea it could hurt. Feeling scared, she walked home and silently went to her room. But later that day, she was once again greeted by her brother. Nobody would know. At school, she finally decided to tell someone. Even though they weren't her friends, she just felt she had to. She walked up to the group of the girls that she would occasionally see in the hallway. They looked like nice girls, and they and Natalie had occasionally talked before.
Hey, Mia?
The ginger girl looked over at Natalie with a straight face. "Yeah?" Mia said to Natalie.
I, really need to talk to you about something. It's been going on for a while, and you and your friends, well, I feel like you're the only people I can trust.
Mia and her friends seemed to be a little smirk, but only for a moment. Little did Natalie know that they were hungry for gossip. "All right, you can trust us. What's up?" One day later was all it took. She had been getting constant remarks on social networking sites such as Facebook. One time, someone even called her a whore. Not to mention, Their lunch had ended up getting in her hair, and it was going to be the least of her problems. But Natalie, being only 9, could not help but be greatly upset at this fact. However, she did not cut, she did not peep, and she never said a word about it. As you may recall, so far in her journey, she had kept everything inside. She supposed it was better. She would never let any pain get the best of her. 3 a.m. School night. Her mother was going to kill her. The girl known as Natalie was now 16. She was productive in high school, close to an honor roll. For once, she felt calm and happy. Though, like the usual, she would occasionally become a hermit in her room, hiding away from her dad, who still liked to constantly yell and scream about the economy, money, and politics, and all the other bullshit that she would never flat out try to hear. Her eyes started to feel heavy. She had an assignment to work on, but it was no longer important to her. All that was on her mind was sleep. She closed her laptop, and after her eyes adjusted to the darkness slightly, she saw her old, worn down stuffed giraffe in the corner. She stared at it, in the complete and utter silence. Memories passed through her mind, and she felt tears coming to her eyes, but quickly she blinked them back.
No more breaking.
She thought to herself, but she continued to stare at it.
What the fuck are you looking at?
She said to the stuffed object. It simply stared back with soft, blank, beady eyes. She shook her head and stood up. She looked down sadly at the little toy animal and gently picked it up in her arms. She cradled it and spoke softly to it.
I'm sorry.
Some tears ran down her face. She pet its rough, short fur softly as she lay down on her bed. She slowly went to sleep. She woke up by an angry growl of her mother. Exhausted, she slowly opened up one of her eyes.
I can't believe I forgot to take that laptop away. You were on it all night, weren't you?
Natalie sighed and pressed her face deeply into the pillow, hugging her giraffe closer. Her mother sighed and walked out. She took a shower, brushed her teeth, and ate some breakfast. Then she got dressed. She put on a gray and blue hoodie with a fur inside its hood. It wasn't her favorite, but it was the only one she could wear to school due to the others being in the wash. She also put on black jeans and some thin, fashionable boots. Finally, she went down the stairs to get driven to school. She hopped in the car and her mother sped off. However, on the way there, due to lack of sleep, she slowly put her head against the window of the car and began to drift off. Her dreams, or more accurately, nightmares, consisted firstly of her physical abuse as a child, and secondly of the sexual abuse she had suffered at the hands of her own brother, Lucas. The abuse had lasted for 4 years before she had the guts to turn him away. She started twitching and cringing in her sleep, but her mother took no notice. Her mother never took notice. Suddenly, she was jolted awake from the sound of her mother's voice.
We're here,
her mother said with annoyance in her voice, most likely from catching Natalie snapping again. She looked at a large sign at the school, which read, Walkerville Collegiate Institution of the Creative Fine Arts. She sighed tiredly and stepped out, putting her backpack on her shoulder.
See ya,
she proclaimed, and closed the door. She walked into the school and chatted with a couple of friends until she went up to her locker on the 3rd floor. She grabbed her books, and before 5 minutes of time was over, she ran to class. Her English teacher annoyingly put her hands on Natalie's desk. Where is your assignment, Miss Olilette? Natalie swallowed.
I forgot it at home. Sorry, Miss Omnwick.
Your time is up, Miss Olette. Don't disappoint me. Natalie seemed puzzled by the thought for a moment. She didn't know why, but those words seemed to melt through her. She simply ignored it and went back to listening to the lesson, and falling asleep not too long after, of course. Later that day, she headed to her locker on the 4th period, when suddenly her boyfriend Chris approached her. Hey, talk to me after school, alright? She smiled. She loved talking to Chris. At the time, she didn't suspect anything. Chris was always sweet to her. During her French class, Natalie failed to pay attention. Instead, she doodles the things that she loved to draw the most: blood, gore, people being stabbed, knives, and macabre things of the sort. Others would say it was pretty dark for her drawing such things, but she saw nothing wrong with it. For some strange reason, it actually felt like a normal thing to her. Miss Olette. She quickly covered her doodles in the paper and looked up at her French teacher quickly, trying to hide her fear.
Yes, Mr. Lavassier?
With a slight turn of his head, he gestured her to move her arm. Show me your work. She hesitantly moved her arm, showing her teacher the pictures of someone getting stabbed by an insane man. The teacher stared, puzzled. Looked at her a bit. She smiled nervously. Erase that and get started on your work, he said with a strangely calm voice. He walked away, and she sighed and began to erase the picture. And Miss Olette, Mr. Laviera interrupted. She looked up at him slightly. Your time is almost up to get your work done. I suggest doing it now. She growled at that remark. Time always seemed to be against her. As far as she was concerned, time could go fuck itself. After class, she walked out of the school to find her boyfriend standing near the fence on the sidewalk. She smiled, walked over, hoping he had something to say that would cheer her up at this miserable day. But as she walked closer, her smile slowly faded. He wasn't smiling back.
Chris, what's wrong? What did you want to talk to me about?
He sighed. Natalie, I think it's time that we should start seeing other people. She felt her heart break.
But why?
Natalie cried. He responded with a stern look. It's your mindset, your drawings. They just creep me out. I think there's something wrong with you. And the saddest part is that you haven't told me why you're acting like this. It makes me feel irresponsible, so I can't do it anymore. I'm sorry. And with that, he walked away. Natalie slammed her hands on the bathroom counter at home. She stared at herself in the mirror, her eye twitching.
I won't hurt myself like the others. I can stay strong.
There was a needle and a black thread in her hand.
It's pointless. It doesn't help.
Some weird sensation pulled at her subconscious. She chuckled slightly.
No, I'm doing it because I want to.
She held up the needle with thread on the end of it and smirked.
Time is up.
Piece after piece, cut after cut, even through excruciating pain was going through her. She did not whine. She did not whimper. She did not cry. There was no more tears to shed. All she did was smile. Blood leaked from the pierce and made a low dripping noise into the sink and onto the counter. When she was finished, she stood back and admired her handiwork. She stroked her horrendous stitches on the side of her mouth, which spread into a wide smile. She felt the warm, wet blood on her fingers and licked it gently, consuming the metallic tasting liquid in pure ecstasy. She stopped when she saw her mother's reflection in the mirror behind her, and sharply turned around. She saw her mother wide-eyed and pale-faced as she looked at her fingers, seeing the blood. She suddenly felt the pain and began to cry.
Mom?
Natalie cried. She had never felt so confused. What had just happened to her? Her mother had scheduled some therapy for her. Natalie had not gotten rid of the stitches, in fear of how much pain it would bring, so she went to the session with them. She made sure her hood was up, and did not let anyone see. She sat down on the comfortable leather seat and stared at the blonde woman across from her in silence. So, your name is Natalie, isn't it? Natalie nodded. I'm Deborah, and I'm here to help. Now tell me, Natalie, what have you been some of your problems recently? Natalie stared.
Time. Time has been my problem.
What about time, dear? Natalie hand roughly gripped the leather of her seat.
Everything. It makes you live through it, slowly progressing through life, being controlled by society, only to be tortured to seemingly no end, as you no longer have a purpose. It's a vicious cycle. Time does not end. It does not slow down. It does not speed up. It's violent. It makes you live through torture over and over again, unable to fast forward through any of it.
Natalie really had no idea what she just said. She felt like she wasn't herself anymore. Could this be because of all the things that she had kept and contained? No, that was impossible. But for some strange reason, she liked it. The therapist led in closure. Sweetheart, I want you to tell me what's happened to you. Natalie continued and stared. There was a long pause. She smirked slightly. The wounds from her stitches opened slightly once again.
Why don't you tell me, Blondie? You're the expert.
Deborah appeared mildly annoyed. Natalie, I can't help you unless you tell me what's wrong. Natalie's fingers started to tear into the leather seating.
Natalie isn't here anymore.
With that, Deborah's eyes widened and she rose to her feet. I'll be right back. Please stay here. She walked out, leaving Natalie alone. Maybe she had done something at that point. She wouldn't have come to be where she is today. Maybe more people would be alive. And maybe she would have been sane like she had been before. As much as I would love to say that Natalie got up from the chair and stopped what came next from happening, I'm obligated to give you the horrid truth. Natalie did not move. She sat perfectly still, in total silent and absolutely calm in that chair. And after a while of waiting impatiently, her parents walked in. Natalie stood, happy to go, but she noticed her parents' expression. Even her father had a strange, silent expression in his face. Her confusion grew, but she said nothing and followed them to the car. On the way, while she thought she was going back home, she started to drift off. Strangely, she heard a dark voice speaking her dream. It almost sounded like her own, echoing into the eternal abyss.
Your time is up.
She shot awake, some red sweat rolling down her face. She wasn't home. She wasn't in the car. She was in her bed, a white bed, in a white room. She looked on her side and realized that she was hooked up to a heart monitor. She attempted to get up, but then when she realized that she was restrained, she panicked. She began to struggle, but because of when she had heard the door open to her left, a man in a white shirt looked at her, his hands behind his back. He resembles one of the cliched doctors you would see in a television program in a scientific lab. She paid full attention as Mr. Scientist started to speak. I can only imagine how very confused you must be right now, he said. But I'm letting you know where you're only here to help. Your parents agreed to allow us to administer medication to you in hopes of helping your state of mind. Natalie opened her mouth to protest, but was quickly silent. You don't need to worry. The doctor sought to reassure you. You'll be back to normal in no time. Just try to relax. He walked over, and as he did, she tried to skitchily move away, but she was unable to do due to the leather straps behind her wrists and legs. He carefully took a mask and put it over her mouth and nose. She stubbornly tried to get it off, but she felt herself starting to slip under as the drugs kicked in, and slowly her eyes closed. Suddenly, Natalie woke up. She couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. She had been given multiple injections and something that was rubbed on her skin. She felt woozy, but was otherwise completely aware of her surroundings. She was entered a rare state of patients sometimes find themselves in a wild underground surgery, in which they are able to see as they were being worked on. In this state, they can feel the pain and their brain is active, but they are unable to respond. Natalie, however, was able to. Her heart rate began to accelerate, as reflected on a nearby monitor, and the doctor took notice of this. They looked at her and took notice her opened eyes. One of the doctors yelled at another. Natalie couldn't make out on what they were saying, but she suddenly felt a rush of adrenaline. Shaking violently, she slowly started to slip out of her bonds. One of the doctors moved to hold her down, but then hesitated to do so. Natalie watched as all three of the doctors backed away in unison. She sat up on the edge of the bed, and in the UV tube from her arm and the mask from her face. She got on her feet and started to tremble towards them. Her breath hitched and her voice was blurry. She was vaguely aware, but when she was chuckling like a madman. But suddenly, she felt a searing pain in her chest. She gripped her chest in agony and dropped to her knees. She coughed up blood, fell prostrate on the floor, and blacked out. Natalie woke up slowly and groggily some time later. She found herself back in bed, and the doctor settled beside her. I'm sorry, Natalie. Something went horribly wrong. Natalie did not know why, but she felt a tremendous amount of hatred towards the doctor. He took notice of her disgust and looked away instinctively. You weren't supposed to wake up while we were giving you those doses for your mental state, the doctor continued. We aren't sure how it affected you, but we have a feeling where we're going to find out. He paused for a moment before taking out a small mirror. The entire time, he looked away from her. Regrettably, the medication impacted your appearance as well. Natalie looked at her in the mirror, and her eye widened. Her eyes were completely green. She noticed she still had the stitches on her mouth as well, but for some reason, she couldn't help but feel overjoyed. Her heart rate began to rise again. She gave a low chuckle. The doctor looked at the shocked as Natalie quickly moved towards him until she got close enough for him to feel her breath.
Doctor,
she began, still chuckling. He trembled slightly and pressed a button to the underside of the monitor. Yes? He stammered in reply.
Your time is up.
A loud scream was heard through the halls of the facility. 2 security guards reached to the door, kicked open the door. Blood. Blood was the first thing they saw. Blood on the walls, on the bed, on the floor, even on the ceiling. Natalie had strapped the doctor to her bed. The bed would bend at a sharp angle, and the doctor's spine was completely snapped. Blood poured from his eyes, nose, and mouth. And there, in the corner, was the murderer, happily drawing her gruesome pictures on the wall in blood, alongside the hastily scribbled phrase, "Your time is up." Natalie slowly turned to look at the guards, and a wide, crazy grin spread across her face.
Hello, friends. Would you like to play?
Natalie began laughing uncontrollably. The guards quickly drew their guns, but before they could act, Natalie charged at one of them. One of the guards fired around, but Natalie was able to dodge it. She grabbed a large knife from the sheath of his pocket and slashed it right across his waistline. Blood and organs flooded out, and he collapsed on the ground. She inhaled deeply, loving the damp stench of death. The remaining guard shook with fear and dropped his gun. She slowly walked up to him, placed the tip of the knife against his chest.
Your time is up.
She slowly slid the knife down his chest, all the way to the end of his abdomen. His organs spilled out on the floor, and he collapsed, dead. Natalie's mother had been sleeping soundly in her room beside her husband. She awoke from the sound of knocking on her door. She groggily got up and walked out to the bedroom and to the front door. It was pouring outside. A thunder boomed in the distance. She approached the door, but paused before grabbing the knob. She detected a faint sound of insane laughter. The rain and thunder seemed quiet down suddenly. She pressed her ear against the door and listened closely.
Hello, Mother.
A voice from the other side called out. Natalie burst through the door, wielding two knives. Her mother stumbled back, hitting her head against a nearby coat rack. One of the hooks penetrated her skull and she bled considerably with the resulting wound. She fell to the ground, paralyzed, but still conscious, lying in a pool of her own blood. Natalie towered over her, and then knelt slowly to meet her mother in eye level and displayed her blood-soaked blades proudly.
I was suffering, Mother.
Natalie cooed. She ran the tip of the knife across her mother's cheek. Cutting it slightly, Natalie tilted her head.
But you did nothing.
All her mother could do was shake and gasp, like a fish out of water. Natalie grabbed her mother and gently laid her flat on the ground. From there, she straddled her and began cutting a V into her chest. Her mother could only gasp and shake as the life drained from her. She choked and gargled, and her breathing became labored. Natalie knew she didn't have much time left. She proceeded to forcibly open her mother's chest cavity with a loud crack, reached in and grabbed the mother's still beating heart with her bare hand. Its pulses were growing further and further apart. Suddenly, she ripped it out. Blood sprayed all over her face. She stared at the mothers directly in the face as she took her final breath.
Sweet dreams.
She said to the mother's corpse.
Your time was up.
She put the heart into her mother's mouth, patting her cheek softly, and stood up. She wasn't done yet. Natalie's father, David, had stride awake and had realized that his wife had not returned to bed yet. His eyes had only just adjusted to the darkness when she suddenly noticed Natalie standing at his bedside with a crazed smirk blistered on her face, and her newly grin-tinted eyes glowing in the darkness. She was covered in blood, and the scent was unbearable. She frowned dramatically.
Oh dear, Mother's gone. I wonder who will get the money. That's all you ever cared about anyway.
As Natalie said, she swiftly grabbed her father's forehead. Her father, unlike her mother, was a fighter, and he sprung up and grabbed Natalie by the neck and threw her to the ground. He started to stomp on her chest until she coughed up blood, and she stared down at her.
Doesn't it feel good, Daddy? After all, you never seemed to mind it all these years ago, did you?
The tall, towering man, he narrowed his eyes at Natalie. You aren't my daughter. A wide smirk spread across her face, and she peered up at him with her humorous eyes, blood dripping down her mouth.
You're right. I'm not.
She suddenly tripped him, causing him to fall hard to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, knives in hand.
They say the bigger you are, the harder they fall.
While he was winded, she grabbed a pillow and stuffed it into his face, and then stomped on it, harder, until a loud cracking noise could be heard. While she finally pulled the pillow away, her father's face was gruesomely mutilated, and he was making muffled noise, crying in agony.
What's the matter, Daddy? Pain too much for you?
She shoved both knives into his stomach and left them there. Then moved to rip one of the large, heavy wooden pole from the bed. She sat it down at her father's legs and withdrew the knives.
Gonna need these.
She chuckled and sat down upon the pole laid on his legs. Suddenly, she started to rock back while sitting down. The weight of her body and the pole slowly started to squeeze his innards up through his body. He started to gag, and blood poured from his mouth. His breath was silenced, and she hit a bit of a snag.
Come on.
She snarled as she forced herself to rock back with more weight. Suddenly, his organs burst out of his mouth. The nasty gore piled onto the floor on the other side of his face. She nodded to his carcass and started to walk out.
Your time was up, Daddy.
Finally, this would be her favorite part. She quickly snuck down to her brother's room, silently opening the door, blood dripping from her knife, making a low tapping sound on the door, and a droplet hitting the hard wood. Her brother wasn't in bed. It was apparent that he was hiding somewhere. She grinned.
Oh, dear brother, come now.
She started to walk inside.
All I want to do is have a little fun.
As she stepped in more, she listened closely for any sound, any breathing, any moving. She even sniffed the air for his putrid scent. And the closer she listened, she finally noticed something, a faint breathing noise. Whack! She fell to the ground, trembling. Her brother was behind her with a now bloody baseball bat. He was glaring down with anger, painting in rage. She tried to get up slowly, and he hit her again and again and again. Mother always did like you best, you bitch! He hit her hard, one last time, before taking a breather. She was bleeding heavily. Her green eye dropped and glowing faintly in the darkness. She felt weak and looked closer up at the ceiling. She recalled the day she had spent in here being tortured, having to go through it for 4 years, looking at the same damn ceiling. It sent a sudden rush of energy into her body, and she started to stand, laughing insanely. Her brother went to hit her again, but used both her knives to block it.
You're going to hell, brother.
With a large push, she sent her brother flying onto the bed. He hit his head against the wall and growled angrily, about to lunge at her when she stabbed with the 2 knives onto his arms, keeping him pinned to the wall. He screamed and struggled rapidly.
Let's see what we can use here.
She started to walk around the room and smirked, seeing a simple butter knife on his bedside. She picked it up and walked over to him.
They say that the eyes are the softest organs on the body. Soft as butter.
She says, slowly licking a knife, as Lucas looked in horror, trying to get away, as she started to dig out his eyes with the knife. He shrieked loudly, and she quickly tied the cloth around his mouth.
Now, we can't have you waking the neighbors.
He wasn't able to see anything. The pain was unbearable. Blood leaked violently from his eye sockets. He would cry, but was now incapable. She dug around for more items and picked up a pair of scissors. She walked over to him, crawled over him.
I think you need to cut loose, brother.
She stabbed the scissors into his gut, and he cried out in muffled screams of pain. She treated him like arts and crafts, cutting through his skin like paper. She lifted up his large intestines and smirked wickedly.
You know what I love? Macaroni art. These might be a little too big to put on a plate, though,
she said while she cut the intestines into sections. She could hear her brother foaming blood from his mouth. However, he had not swallowed the blood back because of the cloth around his mouth.
Doesn't that taste good? I sure know I like it.
He let out another muffled scream. She went down into his toes and started cracking them and ripping them off, one by one. After a while, his screams grew futile. His throat was raw and bloody by now. Next, she worked on his fingers, snapping them and ripping them off slowly. The gargling became louder, and he started to squirm. He was choking on his own blood. She pulled the cloth down, and blood poured from his mouth, and turned his head to the side and vomited violently.
There, brother. Eat this and feel better,
she said, before patting his head and stuffing his fingers down his throat, forcing him to choke on it, and slowly died.
Your time was up.
The girl, known as Natalie, walked into her room dripping blood. Off the corner she saw it, her stuffed giraffe. She knelt down and stared at it. Then, without a word, she stood back up and walked to the bathroom, staring at herself covered in blood. She heard a faint ticking sound. She looked down and saw a pocket watch. She stared at it, hands slowly turning, listening to the ticking for what seems like an eternity. She looked out one of her known red knives and her heavily dripped blood into the counter. She grabbed the pocket watch and disabled the watch until only a small clock was left.
Time makes you live through the torture, slowly progressing through life,
she says, as she slowly brings the knife up to her eye and started to slowly dig into her eye as the vision of her left eye grew blurry and red.
being controlled by society until you find that you no longer have a purpose.
She felt her eye starting to come free from its socket, blood pouring in the sink.
It's a vicious cycle. Time does not speed up. It does not slow down.
She felt it dangle out of her socket, a sharp pain where it was connected to her head. She grabbed into the cord of her eye and tore it right off, the eye falling into the sink.
It is violent. It makes you live through the torture, over and over again.
She started to place the clock in her eye.
Unable to fast forward away from it.
There was a squishing sound and drips of blood until it seems like the clock fit perfectly in her eye socket.
I am clockwork.
The young 16-year-old girl, formerly known as Natalie, walked away from her burning house, the flames engulfing everything, and inside, the giraffe slowly burned, along with the carcass of her family. Some say she still lives on, carrying her insanity with her, leaving so many dead, saying she decided that their time should come to an end. The only way to detect her presence is if you cuddle close to the covers at night, sleeping soundly, but in the darkness she watches. She's determined. You hear her ticking, and you see a green flash that protrudes clock high. If she is there, you know your time is up. Hello everybody, it's me again. I'd like to thank Amanda Guinness for providing her voice for the mother and Natalie, aka Clockwork, for this story. And I wanted to apologize because I originally wanted to post this last night, but the editing process of this was agonizing long than I thought it would be. Let's just say I started at 7, didn't finish the audio editing of this portion until it was 1 a.m. in the morning. Yeah, so now here I am, finishing up again, and wanted to thank her again. I can't thank her enough for providing her voice for this story. But what I would really greatly appreciate is for everybody who listens to this, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell if you want to hear more future stories. I do this because I really enjoy doing this, and I really do appreciate anybody that actually listens to this, even though there's more stories out there that are probably better than mine. But anyway, I provided the way I do it. So I wanted to tell you all this, and have a good night, and try to have sweet dreams.